welcome back to the studio. And now we're sitting here again and we'll take some questions to you, Ola, before we go on. And when I've listened to this, I think a little bit about this of methodological naturalism. And that's very interesting. You were saying that it should not be demanded of in science, yes, that it should be naturalistic in its method. And I think a little bit of that. How do you respond then to God of the gaps argument? That's a classical one that people say that, oh, you are just saying that the God of the gaps is filling in where the science have not found the answers yet. And what do you say? I think those two are connected.
Yes, they are indeed, and I think that's an excellent point, Josef. Because God of the gaps argument means that we say God did it when we don't have a natural explanation, and I think that in order to include God directly or indirectly in science, we need to do it in terms of testable hypothesis. So, and that's something more than God of the gap. So let me give 3 examples. The statement, mankind is 6,000 years old, that's a testable hypothesis. So we use a Bible in order to formulate this hypothesis, but the hypothesis itself does not include God. But so in the context of the language of Karl Popper, God is the context of discovery of the hypothesis, but then we don't use God when testing whether the hypothesis is true or not. Then we do laboratory work and so on. And we could have a second example. There was a worldwide flood 4,500 years ago, from which 8 persons survived. Then again, we use a Bible to formulate this hypothesis, because this is a flood of Noah, but the hypothesis itself does not include God. And so God is a context of discovery, or the Bible is a context of discovery, but not the context of testing whether the hypothesis is true. And the third example is a few hundred years after Noah, there was linguistic diversity and geographic spread because of the Tower of Babel. That's the third testable hypothesis that is inspired from the Bible. And all these 3 examples, they are not God of the gaps arguments, because it's simply not filling in where we don't have natural explanation. It's rather the Bible that gives us testable hypothesis. And we will hear that later on this day, that several talks are inspired by hypotheses from the Bible.
So could I say, if we fulfill the rest of the scientific method, then there is no problem to take away this methodological naturalism as...
Yeah, exactly. And even though we formulate hypotheses that are inspired from the Bible, there will still be a leap of faith in believing that it's God. So if we manage to prove that humanity is 6,000 years old, we descend from one first couple, it's still a leap of faith, but it's a smaller leap of faith saying, yes, God did it. So we sort of take things from the Bible, and then we formulate a hypothesis that's testable. But there are still things like, what exactly did God think about when creating the first couple? There are some details about that in the Bible, but we cannot know all of God's thoughts, because he has only written down part of it in the Bible. So it's like we formulate testable hypotheses from the Bible, but there will still be a leap of faith in order to ask Jesus into your life, for instance, and get a personal relationship with God through that.
I think it was interesting when you talk about leaps of faith here, because you're a Christian scientist, but do people that are agnostics or not at all Christian, do they take leaps of faith when it comes to science? Is a leap of faith only for the believers, or so-called the people that are called believers, or are others involved in leaps of faith as well?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So everyone has a belief system, and all of science is ultimately based on belief, because you need a belief in order to formulate your scientific theories. And they can be based on a secular worldview or a Christian worldview, or some of these hypotheses can be shared between people with different faith assumptions and so on. But there are always faith assumptions behind all of science.
So do you even say that there would be like faith assumptions behind, for example, a Darwinian explanation for the existence of our world?
Yes, exactly. And my point of view is that the main reason why Darwinism is so dominating in our society, that is a secular faith assumption, because this methodological naturalism, you only allow for secular theories or theories without supernatural events, so to speak. So yes, I think the philosophical reason is the main reason why, in my view, why Darwinism is so dominating in our society.
Interesting. I think you were mentioning Karl Popper in your lecture, and he's one of my favorites. Even my scholarly activity is in another area, working with texts and understanding history and so on. But Popper helped me to understand that all science is really depending on theory. It's starting with kind of an assumption somehow. And I mean, he was really a hardcore scholar, so to say, a scientist.
And that's very important, because there was another trend in science earlier, inductivists and positivists and so on, and they believed that you could base science only on data and logical reasoning. But Karl Popper argued, and I think his view is correct, you always need faith assumptions as well.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I have a picture. Let's see if we can get that picture up, because I think all these questions about reality and understanding reality are so essential here. See if the studio can help us to bring up this picture of reality. Yeah. So this is my picture. Now, there is a problem with this picture, because I needed to kind of visualize reality, and I have limited reality. But now I have done a big circle with reality, and that would include everything that exists at all. Then I have a smaller circle, and I call that empirical reality. So empirical reality, that would be the part of reality that is possible to describe, to measure, to weigh, with human methods, to observe. I mean, we have different sciences, we have different ways of doing things, but all of them come together in empirical reality. For example, when I'm working with text, I'm working with actually anti-Semitism in history. I need to look at sources, I need to find sources and to list the sources that talk about a certain thing. You're working in another way. So what do you say about this picture? Scholarship is really working just with a little small part of reality.
Yes, I completely agree, and that is especially true when you work in historical science and questions of origin, because you cannot go back. In historical science, you have written texts and so on, but if you go even further back, the origin of humanity, the origin of life and so on, you need even more faith assumptions, because we cannot go back and know exactly how did things look like at that time. So then the fraction of this circle that is the empirical science part is even smaller for questions of origin, I would say.
So then you both mean that this whole reality, the circle, the big circle, it's not just the supernatural things that science cannot find. It's a lot of things in our reality that the science cannot find either.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I've understood, we haven't listed all the birds existing, all the insects existing, all the herbs existing on Earth. They are still not listed, even if we have lots of scholars working with that. So reality is so much bigger than we have described, But I would even say then we can describe some of the most powerful things in reality. We cannot describe.
Yes, yes.
For example, does love exist?
Yeah.
Does faith exist?
Yeah.
I mean, love and faith can make people do anything. But how do we describe it? How do we measure it? How do we weigh it? How do we grasp it? Reality is much, much bigger. So the problem with that picture is that I do the empirical reality far too big.
Yeah, yeah.
It should be microscopic compared to how big reality is.
And that is very interesting when we're talking about historical events, which Ola was talking a little bit about here. I wrote a question, which I have here, about, you said in your lecture, Ola, that in the case of origins, it's hard to do experiments. And that's what we are talking about here. It's hard to see what happened so long ago. But in some parts of the experimental science, they should be able to do experiments, I think, like from a naturalistic view. They think that the origin of life happened in a naturalistic way, of course, then. And should that not be able to do experiments on? When you are seeing like evolution, it took a lot of time, they say, but in the case of the origin of life, which was completely naturalistic.
I agree with you, Joseph. To some extent, you can set up experiments for the origin of life. We will never know exactly how things look like, and it will always be an approximation, but we can sort of test in the laboratory some aspects of how we thought. Or if you have a naturalistic theory, you can test some aspects of it in the lab. And I would say that the development of molecular biology the last 70 years, it has shown how exceedingly complicated life is. Even each cell is a whole city of activities with lots of machines and things going on. So I would say that it's getting more and more difficult for natural theories to explain the origin of life, but you can still test them. And in that way, you can sort of falsify individual naturalistic theories for the origin of life. But I would still say, even as a Christian, you cannot falsify naturalism in general, because you never know for sure. There could come up some other naturalistic theory in the future. But my belief is still that because of the development of molecular biology, it gets more and more difficult for natural theories to explain the origin of life. But there, as we talked earlier about these leaps of faith, there will always be a leap of faith, and we cannot, with 100% certainty, exclude naturalism only from the science, but we can make it less likely, so to speak.
I think you had an important point there also, that I think it's important to state that, for example, today we are 11 scholars. All of them are PhDs or more, and all of them are working in different kinds of scholarly activity in normal universities. That is, Christianity is not against scholarship, against science. On the contrary, actually, the Christian Church has been like a breeding ground, for scholarly work. Newton, for example, we have many examples of even Darwin was started as a Christian. So that's one important point. But then my other point is this, that it's they say like this, that the Jews are saying sometimes, where there are two Jews, there are three opinions. And when it comes to scholarly activities, all of us who are in scholarly work, we know that there are so many interpretations of the same phenomenon. So therefore scholarship is going on all the time.
Yes.
So someone has this theory, and then comes another person studying the same material from another point of view.
Yes.
I would say, I always talk about the glasses that we are using as scholars, that someone is looking at this problem with other glasses,
Yeah, exactly.
and seeing something new.
Yes.
And therefore interpretation is always there in scholarship. So there is basically nothing like a definite scholarship. A definite scholarly view doesn't exist. I believe in reality. I believe in God. I believe in truth, but I know it's very difficult to get to that truth. And even for the smartest scholars, they have problem. No one can really say. Not even mathematics is definite nowadays.
Yes, yes.
It was when I started. 1 + 1 was 1. Well, 2.
Yeah, and there was a famous mathematician, Gödel, who proved actually that mathematics is incomplete.
Yeah.
And that's a relief, I think.
Yeah.
So mathematics itself has been proven to be incomplete.
Yeah.
So and that, as you said, it goes for all science, and it's like God continues to surprise us in, for instance, in biology, when new research demonstrates how more and more complicated reality is. So we need more and more complicated theories, and so that's so it's very exciting to be a scientist.
Yeah, indeed.